I'm here today with my good friend Philip Yancey to talk about a new book that he has coming out. And let me read the bio that Philip actually wrote for this book because I think it's so entertaining. He says, I worked for 10 years as an editor and then publisher for Campus Life magazine. There I learned journalistic skills, but every year it seemed like I wrote fewer and fewer words. In 1980, my wife Jan and I moved to downtown Chicago where I began a career as a freelance writer. We lived there until 1992 when we moved to the foothills of Colorado. I've written over 30 books, most of them still in print, thankfully. 3 of them I co-authored with Dr. Paul Brand, who influenced me more than any single person. My latest book, Fearfully and Wonderfully, The Marvel of Bearing God's Image, is a revised compilation of that content. My other favorites are Soul Survivor and Reaching for the Invisible God, because both of them force me to dig deep and get personal. I'm a pilgrim, still in recovery from a bad church upbringing, searching for a faith that makes its followers larger, not smaller. I feel overwhelming gratitude that I can make a living writing about the questions that interest me. I just thought that was a wonderful, set of things to say, Philip.
Great.
But the new book that's coming out is called A Companion in Crisis, a modern paraphrase of John Donne's devotions. So, Philip, thanks so much for joining us and spending some time to talk about this new book.
Absolutely. It's always great to talk to you, Brian.
Well, kind of before we get into the new book, I mean, you've written so many amazing books, and I mentioned a couple of them there in the intro. You want to talk about those or any of the other ones before we get into the new one?
Let me talk about books I've written on pain and suffering, because this is one more in a series. The very first book I wrote was a book called Where is God When It Hurts? And I've been so blessed because it took off, I think, as much because of the title as anything else, and became a bestseller. And here it is, still in print some 40 years later. I was 27 years old when I wrote it. I had no business taking on the problem of pain, the great question of the centuries. But as a journalist, I just kept running into people who were going through suffering, and they would say to me again and again, the church makes it worse. I'm just trying to get well. I'm trying to recover. And these people come in and tell me it's my fault. I don't have enough faith, or God is punishing me, or, what do you think? What is the answer here? And I didn't know. I'm just a kid, So I went exploring, and in that process met Dr. Paul Brand, who you just mentioned, who had an amazing perspective on pain, dealing with people who don't feel pain, leprosy patients. And then over the years, people wrote me in response to that book and said, well, my problem is a little bit different. It's not so much physical pain, it's emotional pain. What I feel for my children, the choices they're making, or having a child born with genetic defects. This is a problem that doesn't go away. It's not like I'm hurting physically, but I'm depressed, and they would give me certain other possibilities. And so I wrote a sequel to that called Disappointment with God, which is also still in print. And then just a few years ago, not long ago at all, I wrote another book called The Question That Never Goes Away, as well as The Gift of Pain, and with Dr. Paul Brand. So the pandemic started. I saw people who were publishing books like within 30 days, about God and the pandemic and things like this. And I thought, man, what can you come up with in 30 days to publish on something
really.
that's just now happening? And for years, I've admired this book that John Donne wrote. John Donne was an English poet and then became the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral. Interesting story behind that, which we can talk about if you want. But it happened to be during the bubonic plague. You talk about a pandemic. 1/3 of London died, and 1/3 of London moved away to get away from the disease to live out in the country somewhere. And John Donne is the pastor of the largest church, the vicar of St. Paul's Cathedral. People would come to him for comfort, for understanding. What is God doing? Is God punishing England? Questions like that. And then he got sick, and the doctors diagnosed the plague, and he assumed he was going to die. Almost everybody did die of the plague in those days. So he lay in bed. He wasn't able to consult his Bible or his books. He had to stay in bed. And he wrote this remarkable book called Devotions Upon Emergency Occasions. And it's still ranked. Just recently, one of the newspapers in England voted the 100 greatest nonfiction books ever written in any language.
That's just amazing.
And John Donne's book made it. Even when I was in high school, I presume it's still true. We read some of this very book. No man is an island. Never sin for whom the bell tolls for thee. Beautiful, profound works. However, it was written in 1623. And I would give copies of this book to suffering people and say, man, you got to read this. He's got such good advice, such good counsel. And then I check back with him. Did you read it? Did you read it? Well, a couple pages, because it's Elizabethan English. It's Shakespeare.
That has to be really difficult to wade through these days.
Yeah. One sentence alone, Brian, I counted, had 234 words.
Oh, my goodness.
And we're just not, we don't do that anymore.
Really?
So where fools rush in, I decided what this book needs is a paraphrase, like Eugene Peterson did in The Message to the King James Bible, bringing it up into modern times. And it was very intimidating because I'm dealing with one of the great writers of all time. But I wanted to preserve what was relevant for today. In his day, medical treatment, they would either bleed you or apply pigeons to your mouth to draw away the vapors, And somebody's reading this, they thought, well, what is this guy saying? Well, that was state-of-the-art medicine in the time. However, when you boil it down to one person asking existential questions, one person who gets sick, who thinks they're dying, is God punishing me? These are the same questions we struggle with today. And the questions about the pandemic in 1623, when he wrote, are so similar to the questions of the coronavirus pandemic in 2021, 4 centuries later. So I got to tell you, I've written a lot of books, and it's easier by far to start with a great master like John Donne and try to bring him into another century. So much easier because the meat is there, the thoughts, the words, the images, the metaphors, they're all there. It's just a matter of trimming, bringing out certain things, changing the sentence structure, and relating it more directly to where we are now.
Well, it's an amazing book on multiple levels, what you've done.
And here it is. This is the only copy we know. Just came off the press today, the day we're talking, which is in April. But it's called A Companion in Crisis. And what I hope for this book is that it's around for the next crisis, too. We happen to be in the middle of a pandemic. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down, but we presume a year or two from now, maybe it'll be under control, or hopefully much less. But there will be something else. It may be tornadoes in the south. It may be a wildfire in the west where I live. We're always going through crises. It may be some sort of war. We hope not. But the principles that John Donne came up with apply to all of these different crises. And I wanted a book that could last, not just was timely for the pandemic we're going through right now.
Certainly. Well, if you look across your career and, particularly some of the books that you mentioned, whenever a lot of tragedies have happened, other kinds of crises in the past, you've been kind of a go-to person. You are constantly asked to come and speak, right, in the aftermath of some of these different kinds of crises. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. Well, I live in Colorado. In fact, if you look behind me, you can see some of the mountains.
It looks beautiful
there. And even though we're in the middle of April, it's supposed to be snowing the next 4 days here.
Oh, my.
It's Colorado. And we happen to be, unfortunately, a place that has been cursed by some mass shootings, particularly. There was the Aurora Theater shooting, Columbine High School before that. That was kind of the first big media event tragedy like that. And then just recently, the shooting at a supermarket in Boulder, Colorado. So I do get called on some of these local deals. And then Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, I was called to speak on both of those because people are just devastated, and they want some comfort, they want some perspective, some sort of explanation. How does our faith affect something like this? And then we travel a good bit internationally as well. My wife was a missionary's daughter. My books are published in different countries, and just so happens that we were in Mumbai, India, the night of the attack there with the Taj Mahal hotel being invaded with a lot of people killed.
I remember that. I didn't realize you were there at the time.
Yes, we were. I was supposed to speak downtown within that police cordoned off area that night. Of course,
Wow.
that was canceled, but another group put together a service that night. We were in Egypt, and the day after we left, a tea house where we had met with some friends the day before was bombed, and it seems like they're like there's a little cloud following me wherever we go. There's going to be some suffering, and so that has challenged me, and I've had to come up with my own understanding and my own wrestling. And people like John Donne, people like Dr. Paul Brand have helped me so much. And then as a writer, I'm able to take the wisdom I learned from them and from other people and present it to a broader audience.
Well, just as a side note, I mean, I really have to do a shout out for all the international work that you've done, particularly, the international availability of your books and your availability internationally. When I was doing work for Frederick Buechner and his family, I was investigating some of the international arenas for Christian books, and there were just so many that were not known and not available out of the United States, and especially in Asia. I was working quite a bit over there, but your books were. You were like the only, spiritual Christian writer, contemporary writer whose books were widely available in many of these different countries and many of these different languages.
Well, that's very humbling for me, and it's changed the way I write. I always do what I call an international edit now, so that I try to go through my books and see how they would be read, say, in Indonesia, where Christians are just a tiny minority within a Muslim country, or in Japan, where only 1 or 2% of the population would identify as Christians, and yet they look to the West for so much, or China, where even now Christians are being persecuted, churches are being bulldozed, pastors are still put in jail sometimes, and some of the things we lose perspective on how privileged we in the United States are to have open seminaries. And Christians feel persecuted here when the court rules that you can't pray at a football game or something. That is not persecution. I can tell you about persecution. You go to China, these pastors who are in jail for 20, 30 years and could have gotten out if they just denounced Jesus, and they didn't. They stayed. And here our society is becoming more and more secular, while meanwhile the greatest numerical revival in the history of the world has taken place in communist China in my lifetime. It's remarkable, and it's encouraging to me to come back and to tell some of these stories to the American church, because we don't get a lot of international exposure here, international news, and I feel like I can be an ambassador to bring those words, those encouraging words, those hopeful words back to the United States, where we still do have freedom to worship and freedom to produce books and all sorts of products that we can then share with the rest of the world.
Well, I think as you do, that most Americans just don't get enough international exposure to really understand what the rest of the world is really like.
Yeah.
And so the fact that you've taken the time to do that personally as well as your books. It's just really admirable.
Well, I'm the one who benefits. Of course, none of us are getting international exposure these days because of travel restrictions.
Sure,
but
sure.
I hope that changes and we get back on I was going to say on the road, actually in the air.
Yeah, yeah. So back to Companion in Crisis, the Donne book. Each one of the sections looks like, there's a passage and then a reflection and a prayer. Is that
Yes,
consistent throughout the entire book?
it is. That's actually Donne's own division. Now he had different words, big fancy words like expostulation, and I have kind of an introduction and then a reflection and then a prayer. And each day he would chart out whatever stage of the illness he was in. So I changed those words too, but they follow the progression. First, he gets early symptoms, spots, a fever. Then he's quarantined because that's what you do in a pandemic, certainly in those days. And then he starts being afraid. What if it is bubonic plague? And they call in the doctors. That introduces a new level of fear because the doctors are kind of outside his bedroom whispering among each other and they're not really telling him what's going on. And then they all come in and spread him out. He said, I feel like a map. And these geographers are studying me, looking at this part of my body and that part of my body. And then another time he said, I feel like a sailor just being tossed through the ocean waves. Every day I feel differently. Some of them, I'm feverish and the next day I'm calm, but then I have a rash and then I get nauseated or diarrhea. And he just charts what is common to all of us. But here's one of the great poets who is witty and has a lively mind and can come up with metaphors. And again, as I go through it, I think, yeah, that's how I felt when I had the flu, or that's how I felt the day after I got my COVID shot, And then it gets more serious because he's not far from St. Paul's Cathedral, his church, and he starts hearing these funeral bells. In fact, every day somebody dies because 40,000 people died in London. And many of them were his parishioners in St. Paul's. And he had been conducting funeral after funeral, and now he can't even get out of bed. And then suddenly it occurs to him, wait a minute, maybe that's a bell tolling for me. Maybe I'm worse off than my doctors are telling me, and they've already scheduled my funeral, so a new level of fear comes in. And that's when he says, never send to know for whom the bell tolls for you. And what he's saying is, it could be. So am I ready? If indeed these are my last hours, my last day or so on earth, am I ready? And as he's reflecting there's that other famous phrase, no man is an island. If a clod be washed away, Europe is the less. And he realizes we are all part of the same community. And if one of my parishioners dies, it should affect me. It affects the whole community. A hole has opened up. And I guess we experienced that, I think, in the early days of the pandemic, especially. There was a moment of unity when we applauded the health workers and the news every night talked about another story of someone who died. Unfortunately, in our case, it became kind of a divisive thing over time, a political deal, maskers, non-maskers, vaxxers, non-vaxxers. And I think we have a lot to learn from John Donne, who reminds us, no man is an island, or no person is an island. We're not in this alone. And the only way to defeat something like a pandemic is if we do join hands and have a common enemy, as it were, and then also reach out in compassion to the people around us. We're not alone. And that was the message Donne took away. He realized, I'm being so selfish. I'm only thinking about myself. What if it is my neighbor? I can't get up and go to see them, but at least I can pray for them. And I can write words that maybe will reach them someday. And that's the kind of progression he went through. He's a very honest guy. I don't know if you know much about John Donne's life, but he had he had quite a life. He was raised Catholic in an era when it wasn't cool to be Catholic. In fact, you could be put in prison for being Catholic. And then he wrote this erotic poetry, some would say almost pornographic. It was one of these, dashing young cavaliers. Well, that's two strikes against him. He's Catholic, and he writes this erotic poetry. So everybody knew he had this great talent, but he couldn't really be hired in the court of St. James or King James. He couldn't be hired in the court of King James because it was a Protestant court, and he had this kind of randy reputation, and they didn't have a place for him. So he decided, well, I'll become a minister. I'll become a pastor.
That's the obvious solution, right?
Yeah, right. And people laughed in his day and called it a conversion of convenience. The guy needs a job, so he's got. But it was true. He went to Oxford and Cambridge, and he became a minister. And his sermons are some of the greatest sermons ever written. He wrote one about death called Death's Duel, about his own struggle with death. And he's rich theologically, but he's also down to earth because of his past. He knew who he was. And when he was lying and tossing and turning in bed, he has a whole chapter on insomnia. What comes back to him are the days of his ill behavior as a young person. So he wonders, well, maybe God has punished me. Maybe God is nailing me to the bed where I committed so many sins. And these are the kinds of things that occur to all of us. They're not particularly healthy, but somebody gets cancer. God, what are you trying to tell me? God, did you do this? These are questions we all have. And John Donne just wrestled with them in a very honest and transparent and theologically rich way.
What an amazing man, and like you said, 400 years ago, or whatever. I mean, it's just the depth of thought and perception that a person had that many years ago. It's just amazing.
It just taught me some things don't change. The science changed remarkably. And one of the things I did in my book is I took out all this kind of old-fashioned science. As I mentioned, medicine was primitive. They hadn't even discovered the germ theory yet. They had no idea what caused. They thought it was that illness was caused by breathing these vapors, these kind of mysterious vapors, and you get these humors in your body, and we got to purge you to get rid of those humors. That's how they treated people. There were no drugs, nothing that could really help you. And so I removed that because it's kind of weird and it's outdated now. But what was left, one person wrestling with God, these existential questions of why do bad things happen? What are you trying to tell me? Here I am. I'm your servant, God. I should be in the pulpit, and instead I'm quarantined and nailed to a bed. What good is that? What kind of meaning can I find out of that? These are the questions that we all have our own versions of.
Right.
And John Donne just is able to express them in a way that gives perspective and comfort to me and to many other people over the centuries. Think of it. His book has never been out of print. 400 years.
Goodness.
400 years. It's never been out of print. That's a classic.
That's the definition of classic, isn't it? So, I mean, I'm really thrilled that you were able to do this paraphrasing and get this book out so quickly. Unfortunately, the pandemic is not over yet. Mm. And you were able to, get this out while we're still, hopefully at the end of it or ending of it. But how did you do that so quickly?
For the first time ever, I did kind of a hybrid self-publishing thing. I've worked with several publishers, maybe 4 or 5 over the years. And in the old days, publishers did all the work. You would just write a book and mail it in, literally mail it in a package. And they would typeset it and produce it and design it and market it. And it would appear in bookstores. And, I'm just sitting there waiting for them to do their thing. Well, as we know, things have changed a lot. You deal with this all the time, Brian. Uh, Publishers, bookstores, they're probably 2/3 of all bookstores are gone now. And people don't normally just go to a bookstore to see what's new. They go online, or they follow a writer on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or something. And that's how they find things out. So it seems like more and more writers are required to do the work, you know. Well, I do have a big book I've been working on for a long time, at least the last 3 years. It's a memoir that's coming out in October of this year, 2021, with Convergent Press. The title is Where the Light Fell. In fact, they're just revealing today, the same day this book is being released, they were revealing the cover of that book and officially announcing it to the trade.
Wonderful.
And they have a major investment there. They really want this book to work. And when I talked to them about doing a book on the pandemic at the same time, you know, they were saying, well, we don't want anything to take away from your memoir. That's where we're putting our eggs. And I said, well, I understand. I don't want that to happen either. So what I'd like to do is just make it available, and maybe we can do a 2-for-1. And we finally came up with this deal. We have produced this paperback edition, which you can buy, but it's print on demand. Bookstores generally aren't going to stock it. You can find it on Amazon, Christian Book Incorporated, things like that, but you have to look for it. We're not really marketing. Instead, we're doing an ebook version that is you can't buy anywhere. It's only available if you pre-order the memoir. So you can go on my website, philipyancey.com, or same thing on Facebook, just my name, and find out how to do that. But if you pre-order, then you'll get a receipt, and you send in the receipt, and they immediately give you a PDF file of this book, John Donne's book. So it's kind of 2-for-1. You get a $15 value book digitally if you pre-order the memoir. So for those who want it, you know, I'm going to be giving away copies, and I hope a few people do buy it, but that wasn't my main goal. My main goal was just to get the words out there while they're still relevant. And they are, in today's news, they're relevant every day. So we hope that people will jump on the good deal we're offering them and get a free copy of the book in digital form.
Well, I hope the memoir and the 2-for-1 deal really does well, but I also hope that just this paperback that, you know, is coming out today does really well too, because I think it's a phenomenal piece of work and can really benefit folks. So, you know, I hope that it sells more than what Convergent expects.
Well, thank you. Just this week, we've been dealing with the UK, and they're very excited about it. They want to do kind of they call it a cased edition, where there's a little, like a leather book that fits inside a case that you can buy, because he's their guy, you know.
Sure, of course.
He's one of the great authors in English history, and yet they have the same problem that American readers do. The language takes so much work, not that many people will do it. So we're trying to simplify it. They really like what I've done, and just make it available. The insights, the wit, the perspective, these things cross the centuries. They're still there, and just to make them accessible.
Well, that's excellent. I'm glad to hear that, you know, they're interested in doing that. I mean, it makes total sense. Well, Philip, you know, thanks so much for all the fine work that you've done and sharing your gifts with the rest of us. We've certainly benefited tremendously. And, you know, this is just another quite compelling example of that.
I am so privileged, and especially to be able to sit there for several months and work with one of the great minds and one of the great wordsmiths in history. It's just a privilege. And even if I did it only for myself, it would be worth the time, worth the expenditure. And to think that maybe after I'm gone, 20, 30 years from now, maybe those words, this book could still be around and I feel like a channel from John Donne 400 years ago to modern times. It's a privilege, and so much of my writing, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. So I look at people like Frederick Buechner, C.S. Lewis, G.K. Chesterton, people like that, Thomas Merton. These are the people I learn from, who nourish my faith, and I'm able to take their perspectives and in a more journalistic way present them for others who maybe don't have the time or wherewithal to spend as much time reading and researching as I do. But that's my job. You know, these are questions we all have. We all wonder about the universe and God and why we're here and things like that. But a lot of people only think about that on Sunday morning. I think about it all day long. That's my job, you know. So I'm privileged as a writer to wrestle with these things, and I'm just happy to make that contribution.
Well, I think that this book, as well as many of your other books, are going to bless people for decades, you know, maybe centuries to come. You know, it's just really an incredible gift that you've given people.
Well, thank you for your part in helping many writers. I happen to be blessed by living in kind of the golden age of Christian publishing. It's harder now. It's a lot harder. There's a lot more bandwidth. It's so easy for anybody to publish that there are now hundreds of thousands of books a year, whereas there used to be, you know, much fewer. It's hard to get attention, and you are helping to shine the spotlight on writers and also develop writers. I know through your various courses and the conferences you organize. So you're doing a great service in your own right. So thank you for that, Brian.
Well, thank you very much. It's my privilege, you know, to be doing this kind of stuff too. But you're right in terms of how dramatically the world of publishing, the world of books has changed.
Yeah.
And will continue to evolve, I think, you know, in ways that, you know, you and I at this point can't vision yet. But anyway. Well, thank you again, Phil, for spending some time with us and for doing all this work. Greatly appreciate all of that. And, you know, we'll look forward to, you know, doing this again when the memoir comes out.
That's right. 2 in a year. I've not done that before, but it's been a busy year and an eventful year. So we'll see what happens. And I'll see you again, at least in October, when Where the Light Fell comes out.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
All right. Thank you, Brian.